If you're a fundraiser who is exhausted from chasing donors who ghost you, this video is for you. Networks alone do not raise predictable money anymore. Clear, decision-grade funding gaps do. What nobody tells you, much of the advice that worked 10 or 15 years ago is now the very thing burning fundraisers out. And if you keep following it, donor replacement gets harder every single year, not easier. The big problem is this. Fundraisers are taught to work their networks, build relationships, nurture donors, send updates, ask for money, and then wait and wait some more. And when the silence stretches on, they assume they did something wrong. So they work harder. They have more meetings and more follow-ups and more updates. And most of the time, they still get ghosted. You can be doing everything you were trained to do and still hit a wall. You can be working harder than ever while revenue stays flat. And the burnout that follows is not because you're a bad fundraiser. It's because the system you were taught no longer matches the market you're operating in. If you don't know me, my name's Gretchen Villegas. I've raised over $75 million for global development. I've managed more than $320 million across 300 plus countries. I started my career living in a 600-person village along the Amazon. There were no roads, no electricity, no running water. That experience shaped how I see development and fundraising today. Real development is not about having all the answers. It's about being a bridge to the resources communities actually need in a way that respects their reality. Let me ground this in a story. I once watched an entire fundraising team at an international nonprofit burn out in slow motion. For almost 12 full months, they submitted proposal after proposal. They followed the guidelines, they tailored language, they tracked deadlines, and they did not win a single one. Month after month, it was either rejection or silence. At first, they were confused. Then they became frustrated. Then something worse happened. Motivation collapsed. Creativity dried up. Innovation stopped. And you could just feel the energy drain out of the room. These were smart, capable people who cared deeply about the mission. But because they could not figure out what was going wrong, they started to internalize the failure. Eventually, it became really hard to watch, not because they were failing, but because the system they were operating inside gave them no feedback, no clarity, and no leverage. That experience stayed with me because it revealed something fundamental. Chasing money without clarity does not just fail to raise funds, it actually erodes the people doing the work. Now, let me give you these facts that explain why this keeps happening. First, donor counts are falling. Sector benchmark data shows donor participation declining for multiple consecutive years, even while total dollars raised hold steady. Or that means more organizations are competing for fewer active donors. The decline is concentrated in small dollar donors and new donor acquisition, not in top gifts. So that means, in practical terms, fundraisers are being pushed into more competition for a shrinking pool of people. Second, retention is brutal. Recent benchmarks show new donor retention as low as 13.8%. Overall retention hovers around 18%. And that means if your strategy depends on replacing churn with more churn, you're building a leaky bucket on purpose. You spend your energy replacing donors instead of building momentum. This is the burnout engine. Third, the money is concentrated. Major and supersized donors account for roughly 3/4 of all dollars raised. Micro donors make up half of all donors, but contribute only around 2 to 2.5% of total revenue. So depending on the quarter, yet much of the day-to-day labor of fundraising is still oriented around volume rather than clarity. You're being trained to overwork for the smallest piece of the pie. Here's where many organizations misdiagnose the problem. They think the solution is better relationships, better storytelling, more personalization, more cultivation. But that assumes the old model still fits. The old model was relationship-first fundraising. You prospect people, you nurture with updates, you ask, you get ghosted, and you repeat. This model worked better when donor counts were growing, when fewer nonprofits competed for attention, and when general goodwill giving was easier to convert into checks. The environment changed, but the training did not. Hey, this is Gretchen. If you liked what you heard today and you would like to learn more about building resilient financial organizations, you can find more value in the description below by clicking on the Nexus Impact Spotlight. There's lots of information that you can use and actually apply yourself today. The new model is clarity first fundraising. Donors are not primarily buying your story, they're buying a measurable outcome, a credible plan, a defined role that they can play, and low friction to say yes. Stop chasing donors does not mean do less fundraising. It means stop doing sales outreach for a product you have not clearly defined. Most fundraising today is backward. Organizations start with a donor list. They write appeals, they ask for money, then they explain impact later. The reverse approach starts with an investable outcome and works backward. You make the funding gap so specific that the right funders self-select. This is what I call the precision-driven impact model. You start with outcomes, not donor lists. Here's how it works. First, you define your outcome inventory. These are the outcomes you can describe in plain language and credibly deliver in the next 6 to 18 months. They're not aspirations, they're not vision statements, they're real outcomes. And each outcome must answer 5 questions. Who changes? What changes? How you measure it? By when? And what it costs. For example, 200 families avoid eviction in 9 months. You measure court filings averted and rent arrears resolved. It costs $480,000. That's $2,400 per family stabilized. Second, you turn outcomes into an impact decapitable map. For each outcome, you list current funding committed, total funding required, and then you see the gap and the return on investment framing. Return on investment does not mean financial profit to the donor. It means that changes per dollar, what were the changes, and what harm is prevented. It's about making the consequences legible. Third, you publish the funding gap. Yes, publicly. This is the step most organizations resist, and it's where the leverage lives. A public gap map does 2 things. It qualifies serious partners, and it repels misaligned funders very early on. That reduction in ambiguity dramatically reduces the ghosting. I've seen this work in practice. One nonprofit I work with publicly named a clear funding gap tied to a specific outcome. They stated exactly what was funded, what was not funded, and what would not happen without additional support. Internally, this felt terrifying. It exposed trade-offs. It surfaced uncertainty. It revealed the limits of existing resources in that organization. Everyone expected donors to pull away. Instead, donors leaned in. They reached out with genuine questions. They wanted to understand how they could partner more deeply. What surprised the team most was just that it worked and how it worked. They ended up with fewer donors overall, but far more serious ones. And those donors actually funded the gaps. A donor approaches when the decision's easy. Your gap must be specific. $180,000 short is very clear. It must be bounded, time boxed, and ready for delivery. It must be role-based. You can close the training gap this way, and it must be verifiable with clear proof points and a clear reporting rhythm. If your ask is vague, funders delay. The delay is not rejection, it's actually indecision. Your job is to create a container capital can move into quickly. I once saw this play out in real time with a corporate donor representative when I clearly articulated the exact amount of funding required to close the gap for a farming family in India to move from below the poverty line to actually being able to pay for all their basic needs. His posture completely changed. What had been polite interest before turned into genuine excitement. I could tell instantly that this information is what he was looking for, not because he suddenly cared more, but because he could finally see how to justify the decision internally. That points to something fundraisers rarely talk about. Donors do not need to be convinced that the work matters. Most already believe that. What they need is help defending the decision. They have to explain it to management, to donor committees, or to their boards. Your clarity becomes their protection. I learned this lesson the hard way early in my career. I once lost a major partnership, not because the work was misaligned, but because the ask was too vague. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but it was not bold enough. It did not clearly state the problem being solved, what would happen if the partner did not fund it, or the specific role their funds would play. The proposal was not rejected outright. Instead, it just quietly died. There were no follow-up meetings, just a polite note saying, well, we might revisit this in the future. That's what vagueness costs you. Here's my most controversial belief about fundraising. Much of the sector underperforms because the ask is too timid. Fundraisers are trained to avoid being specific, to hide consequences, and to keep everything flexible in the name of being donor-friendly. In practice, this is risk aversion disguised as courtesy. It forces donors to do the hardest work themselves, deciding without clarity. Then fundraisers blame them when they do nothing. Being clear is not being aggressive. It's being respectful of how decisions actually get made. Of course, transparency feels risky. Most fundraisers are not afraid of donors reacting badly. They're afraid of the questions transparency invites. Why this population, they ask. Why this strategy, they ask. Why not fund something else, they ask. And those questions require tight alignment between the fundraiser and the programs teams. And many fundraisers have not been given that access. That internal discomfort is often the real barrier, not donor reaction. I've even had funders explain to me directly why they ghosted organizations. The reason was not emotional, it was basic. They did not know what the organization was actually asking for. There was no clear problem statement. There was no clear solution and no explanation of how funds would change any outcomes. So from the funder's perspective, those were baseline requirements. This is why clarity-first fundraising needs systems. System 1 is the investable narrative asset stack, a one-page gap map, a proof page with 3 to 7 hard proof points, a partner menu with 3 giving roles, a gap closer, a capacity builder, a matching catalyst, and a one-page monthly delivery memo. And of course, a 15-minute decision call script with a binary next step. These assets do the pre-selling, so you don't have to. System 2 is the always-on credibility loop. Your goal is to be found when someone is looking. Effective organizations solving a specific problem, partners for corporate volunteering or grant-ready implementers. Many corporate and foundation pathways are now invitation only. We know that. Visibility and credibility outside the application window matter more than ever. System 3 is the funder source routing pipeline. Each source is treated as its own channel. Individuals are routed to gap roles and matching challenges. Donor-advised funds are routed to clarity that triggers recommendations. Corporate partners are routed through employee engagement. Foundations are routed through outcomes, fit, and credible plans. Government and institutional grants are routed through compliance and unit economics. Here's the reverse fundraising method in practice. Phase 1, build the gap map. List outcomes, cost them, quantify them, and define 3 partner roles per gap. Phase 2, package the decision, build the asset stack. Phase 3, run inbound motion, publish delivery memos weekly or biweekly, and route every touch point to a clear action. Phase 4, convert with a 15-minute decision call. Confirm the outcome, confirm the gap, confirm the role, confirm the reporting rhythm. Decide yes or no, or a specific follow-up date. This works for small organizations as well. In fact, the smaller you are, the more clarity matters. You can't rely on brand recognition. You must make the decision easy for the donor. Underneath all of this is a power shift. If your revenue depends on persuading a small number of individuals with disproportionate influence, you'll drift toward their preferences. Publishing outcome-based funding gaps reduces that dependence, increases accountability to delivery. Fundraising today is not primarily relationship building. It's decision engineering. Make outcomes and gaps so legible that capital can move without persuasion. So ask yourself this: what would change if you stopped chasing donors and started publishing funding gaps today?